So last week we looked at the accuracy of prophecy, about how that for me, what separates the Bible from any other book or any other religious book is the words of prophecy contained within it. And we looked at Daniel, at the book of Daniel, and the prophecies that Daniel speaks. But not only the prophecies, how specific they are and how accurate they are, and the interpretation of them. So he prophesies about the 4 empires that are to come, which was the Babylonians. He was under the Babylonian Empire. Back then he was taken from Judah and brought to Babylon along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So he talks about the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians who took over from Babylon, the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and then the Roman Empire, which was the last one. And you can read that through Daniel in Daniel chapter 2, I think it was. And then you've got other prophecies in Daniel 5, 6, and then 7, 8, and 9 is just ridiculous. And so we finished off looking at Daniel 9 within the 70 weeks. So what I need you to understand, in Daniel chapter 9, if you want to flick there again just to remind ourselves of what that specific prophecy is. And if you want an email of notes, then drop me a message. If you didn't get any email last week and you want me to catch you up, then I can do that. Last week was a bit of a head melter. Because of the, I don't know how to describe it, just because of the prophecies and what Daniel's prophesying in the years that kind of expand beyond that there, that it's hard, kind of to wrap your head around. But you watch it. If you're still struggling with it, I'll catch up with you. We can sit down and we can go through it, and we can come to, we'll try to come to an understanding of what Daniel is prophesying. But in Daniel chapter 9, if you can go to verse 24, and Daniel says this, he says, 77s are decreed for your people, for your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision, and to prophesy, and to anoint the most holy place. So 77s is 70 lots of 7. And what he's talking about here, it's 70 lots of 7 years. And what he goes on to say, so try and keep that in your head, 70 lots of 7 years. And he goes on to say in verse 26, after the 62-7, we'll go back to verse 25. He says, no one understand this. That was what we looked at last week. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 77s and 62-7s, and it will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. So what he's saying in verse 25 is there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens, so that's 69 lots of 7 years. And so this is what we looked at last week. 69 lots of 7 years until the Messiah reveals himself. And what happened was, from what he says is from the time that the decree is given to rebuild Jerusalem, that happened if you read the start of Nehemiah, there's a decree given by King Artaxerxes to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. There's other decrees given to rebuild the temple, but King Artaxerxes gives a declaration, a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, and you can read about that there in Nehemiah. And whenever you look at the time period, that takes you up to the very moment where Jesus walks into Jerusalem, he rides into Jerusalem on the back of the donkey. And that's the only moment in the life of Jesus where he publicly declares he is the Messiah. There were other times where he's speaking to people. He's speaking to the woman at the well, and he reveals himself to her as the Messiah. There's many other times where he in some way reveals himself to the disciples or the small groups of people that he's the Messiah. But this is the only public declaration and public fulfillment of prophecy. He's fulfilling Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9. Where Zechariah prophesies, you see your king is coming, riding on the back of a donkey. And so this is why the Pharisees tried to stop Jesus doing what he was doing on that day, on Palm Sunday. because they recognized that Jesus was fulfilling Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9, which was a messianic prophecy. So there's loads of prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about a coming Messiah. And this is one of them, and Jesus is fulfilling this here. So what Daniel is saying is, from that moment the decree is given, that Artaxerxes gives that decree, there will be 69 lots of 7, and then the Messiah will reveal himself, and that's what Jesus did. But we're left with still one lot of 7, with one lot of 7 years. We're going to deal with that next week. It's what we call the tribulation period, but we will kind of touch on it as we go through this here. So I just want you to keep that in mind. So we come to, we're going to go through tonight Matthew 24. We're also going to finish off with Matthew 25, so remind me of that there if I forget about that there. Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Because of talking about the times of the end, or the end of the age, the end times, as we would say. So let's read through. I want to read through quickly Luke 21. So get your Bibles to Luke 21. This is what's known as the Olivet Discourse. It's a sermon that Jesus preached, not even a sermon. He's actually answering questions that the disciples posed to him. But it happens on the Mount of Olives. So if you're in Jerusalem, you've got Jerusalem, and then you've got the Kidron Valley that then goes up to the Mount of Olives, and then beyond that there is Bethany. And Jesus a lot of times would have walked from Bethany down the Mount of Olives, down the Kidron Valley, and then up to Jerusalem. And it's an amazing place to be, just to sit there and to look over the city, and just to sit on the Mount of Olives and just to see everything and to be there and experience, just to kind of, because there are still stones there that are from the time of Jesus that kind of come up. So whenever you're walking, you're actually walking on stones that Jesus would have walked on whenever he was on this earth. So what happens is, it's coming very close to the end of Jesus' time on earth. And he's in Jerusalem. He's with his disciples, and Pharisees are gathered, asking him questions and stuff like that there. There's kind of a lot going on. And as they're leaving Jerusalem, as they're walking through Jerusalem, the disciples begin to reference the temple. Now, the temple was unbelievable. The temple was would have been one of the wonders of the world back in its day. It was absolutely an amazing building, absolutely incredible, and was known around the world at that time for just how amazing it was, and people would come to Jerusalem just to see the temple. And as they're walking through the streets of Jerusalem, the disciples talk to Jesus about the temple. And they say, Jesus, isn't this amazing? Check out this building. Isn't this incredible? And then Jesus' response is, you know what, guys? This place is going to be destroyed. And his actual words are, not one stone will be left on top of another. And whenever you're walking through the streets of Jerusalem, you actually come to a point where the old temple would have been, where the old city would have been, and all you see are these big, huge stones that are just kind of lying there, not one on top of another. And we'll explain why that happened maybe a little bit later on. But let's go back to Luke chapter 21. Some of the disciples, pick it up from verse 5, some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Teacher, they asked, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place? I want you to highlight, if anybody wants, there's paper and there's pens at the back. You can take some notes. But if you highlight verse 7, those questions, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place? And if you go to Matthew 24, because what we're going to kind of look at here is there is a slight distinction between Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are very, much the same, but Luke 21 is slightly different. So in Matthew 24, what it says in verse 3, it starts off the same. They were at the temple, and then Jesus in verse 2 says, do you see all these things? Not one stone will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. So I want you to compare verse 7 to verse 3. And in verse 3 in Matthew 24, it says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So I want you to understand that there are encompassed within this here, with what is being asked, there are actually three questions being asked here. And the three questions that Jesus are, as in response to him saying this temple is going to be destroyed, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? There are three different questions that Jesus is going to answer here that we can read the answer within Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13. And as I say, Mark 13 and Matthew 24 are pretty much the same. So Jesus is answering those three questions. For those who used to come to DTC, you'll remember this here, that the writers of the Gospels are writing, number one, they're writing years after the actual events happen, but they're accurate in their description of events. But their purpose for writing their different Gospels is for different reasons. So Luke is a doctor, he's a physician, and he is writing, if you go to the start of Luke, then he tells you why he's writing this here. He's writing it to a guy called Theophilus, but he's writing mainly to Gentiles, to people that aren't Jews. Matthew takes a different perspective because Matthew is writing to Jews. That's why whenever you read through the Gospel of Matthew, that Matthew very often references Old Testament prophecy. So when it comes to the birth of Jesus, he references that it was prophesied about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. This was to fulfill the prophecy in Isaiah. He often references Old Testament prophets, be it Isaiah or Jeremiah, and he looks back. So he's showing the Jewish people, this is your Messiah. This is what was prophesied about him. He fulfilled these prophecies. So they've got different reasons. They've got a different audience. And so sometimes what happens throughout the Gospels, then they have a different focus. As they're writing their story, they're writing it with people in mind and with a different purpose in mind. So it's not that they contradict each other. They actually complement each other, but they've got their own reasons and purposes for saying what they're about to say. So that's why there's something slightly different here, because what's going to happen at some point is Luke's going to go off in a slightly different direction than Mark and Matthew. And so I need you to understand that there. So we're three questions being asked. When will these things happen? When will the destruction of the temple happen? What will be the sign of your coming back to this earth? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? Okay, so let's go back. So write those three questions down, keep that in mind. Let's go back to Luke 21, because their question to Jesus is, when are these things going to happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to happen? Is there any signs that we can follow, that we can see, that shows us that the temple is going to be destroyed? So he replied in verse 8 of Luke 21, watch out that you're not deceived. This is something that is, again, there are a few things here that overlap, that complement each other. And the whole deception thing is one that you will see in Luke and Mark and in Matthew. Watch out that you're not going to be deceived. The problem but with deception and with whenever we're being deceived is that we don't know we're being deceived. You ever been in that position where it's not until later on and you look back and think, you know what? I was done there. But whenever you're in the middle of it, you know, you're like, no, everything's all good. So whenever you're being deceived, you don't actually know. But Jesus is warning us, watch that you're not deceived. This reminds me of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and with Eve being deceived by the serpent. And it was just such a simple and subtle question, because Satan comes to her, has a conversation with her about this tree that they weren't supposed to eat from. And Eve explains to him, this is why we're not allowed to eat of this fruit, because if we do, then we're going to die. That's what God said. And then just a simple little question, did God really say that? Is that really what he meant, Eve? And puts this seed of doubt in her mind. And then he builds on that deception. He deceives her and turns it round so that she is now looking at what was originally sinful to touch, to eat of, to reach out for, to now being something where, well, why wouldn't I? And that's what deception does. to us. And so Jesus is warning us, watch out that you're not deceived. You can pick that up in all three transcripts here. For many will come in my name, claiming I am he. The time is near. The time is near. Do not follow them. And then verse 9, 10, and 11 corresponds with Matthew 24, verse 4, 6, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So he says, when you hear of wars, of uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, pestilence in various places, and fearful events, and great signs from heaven. So let's compare that to Matthew 24, where Jesus again says in verse 4, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars, rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And then Matthew says in verse 8, all these are the beginning of birth pains, or the beginning of sorrows. So what Jesus is starting off here with is talking about wars, rumors of wars. But he says, don't be alarmed by this. And sometimes what we see happening, again, people often ask, are we living in the end times? The answer is yes, we're living in the end times. But in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to reveal to you and show you that we have always been living in the end times, because John talks about in these last days, and he was writing 2,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago, the disciples believed they were living in the last days. And the disciples were actually waiting on Jesus to return in their lifetime. And there seems to be like a lot of, generations that believe this is the generation where Jesus is going to return. I believe that this is the generation that Jesus is going to return, but I don't hang my hat on it. And I don't build my life around that there. I build my life around the fact that Jesus Christ died for me and that he rose again. Anything else, take it or leave it. It's all about Jesus Christ and what he has done for us. And what we're told at the end of this here is just simply to be watchful and to be ready, and we'll finish with that there. So he says there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, but that's okay. Don't worry about that. They have to happen. They have to take place. And then he talks about earthquakes and famines, pestilence and disease. If you take a note of this here, so you've got those things, and you've got false Christs in Matthew 24, verse 4, and Luke 21. And I can email you this bit as well, so I will. Then you've got wars, you've got famines, you've got pestilence, and you've got earthquakes. And if you compare that to, if you flick over to the book of Revelation, and we will at some point begin to look into the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 6, and it's the opening of the seven seals. And it starts with, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. The Lamb is Jesus Christ. So he is the only Messiah. So Matthew, Luke are talking about false Christs, but there is only one Christ, one Messiah. I heard the four living creatures say in a loud voice like thunder, come. And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow. He's now talking about what we can talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So the first rider to come out is a white horse who held a bow. And he was given a crown, and he's rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. That's war. It's the first one that Jesus talks about. So I want you to look at how these correspond with each other. The next thing in 24, Matthew 24, verse 7, and Luke 21, verse 11, talks about famines. When the Lamb opened the second seal in Revelation 6 and verse 3, I heard a second living creature say, come, and then another horse came out, a fiery red one, and its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. And to him was given a large sword. And when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third creature say, come, and I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding scales in his hand, and I heard what sounded a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. Do not damage the oil and the wine. And we're talking about famine here. So you've got wars, you've got famines, and you've got pestilence. As the next horse comes out, and it was death coming out. So you can see how all these correspond whenever you look at Revelation, and we're going to look at this at some point later on. And he goes on, He was given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by famine and by plague and by wild beasts of the earth. So you can see how all these kind of, as Jesus is prophesying, how it corresponds and correlates to what's being spoken about in Revelation chapter 6. And then in verse 12 of Revelation chapter 6, he says, I watched as he opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs dropped from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So you've got the wars, you've got the famines, you've got the pestilence, and you've got earthquakes that are all spoken about by Jesus in Matthew 24 at the start there and in Luke 21. And you can pick up on them in Revelation chapter 6. So this is how Jesus starts, and that corresponds. This is where it kind of takes now a little bit of a diversion. So we're going to deal with Luke's first, with what Luke says first of all. Because I think that Luke is dealing with the question of that was asked at the start, when will these things happen, and what are the signs that this is about to happen? And there's a little bit of what Jesus, whenever Jesus is speaking and he's prophesying about the temple and about its destruction, but he's also talking about end times. But Luke's focus here is on the temple and when that is going to happen. So verse 12, it says, but before all this, in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 9, which is right after, what we've just looked there about the earthquakes and the famines, Matthew starts in verse 9 with then. So Matthew's going later, but Luke is saying, before all this happens, this is what's going to happen. They will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. And you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand on how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed, even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me. Not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life. I don't know if they're maybe regretting asking that question at the start. Whenever you're hearing you're going to be put to death, some of you. But remember, Jesus is talking, he's given this little synopsis of the wars, of the rumors of wars, of the uprisings, of the earthquakes, nation against nation. But then he says, before this happens, this is what's going to happen to you. And in verse 20, he says this, he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. And Jesus is now answering the question, what will be the sign that this is going to happen? If you're telling us that the temple is going to be destroyed, you give us a sign of what's to happen. He says, armies are going to surround Jerusalem. That's going to be a sign. Watch out for that happening. And he goes on in verse 21 and he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women, nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against the people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. A Gentile is anybody that is not a Jew. And what you have happening, just to kind of give you a historical context of this here, Jerusalem and Israel is under the, what's the word I'm looking for? Ownership of Rome. Rome is that fourth empire that Daniel prophesied about. And so Rome is taken over Israel. And it is Rome that will destroy Jerusalem. And so Jesus is prophesying, watch for armies surrounding Jerusalem. And we're going to explain what happens in just a few minutes. And then he goes on in verse 25. Then there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nation will be in anguish, perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. He told them this parable, verse 29. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves, and you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And then in verse 36, he says, be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, so that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. Okay, keep your finger on Luke 21. I want to go through Matthew 24, and then we're going to piece all this together. So Matthew's kind of started off the same. And then in verse 9, then, this is where we have a little bit of a discrepancy between the two, because their focus is on something different. And what Matthew talks about then, he says, you will be, from verse 9, he says, then, so after all of these things that he's spoken about the wars, the rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, the famines, the earthquakes, then you will be handed over and be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Verse 14, highlight that. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So one of the keys for Jesus to return is that the gospel is preached in every kingdom, is that the gospel is preached around the world. Verse 15, you really need to highlight this one, because this is what we're going to kind of touch on in just a second. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one could survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is a Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. I think also one of the things that we got to kind of then look out for is whenever we come talking about the Antichrist, is that there's a belief that he will be able to perform signs and wonders and deceive people. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and heavenly bodies will be shaken. You can pick up on that in Joel chapter 2. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send the angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other will be left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. Understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Down through church history, people have tried to put dates on the return of Christ. The most recent one, in the 1980s, there was a guy that wrote a book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988, and it was a bestseller. In 1989, he wrote a book called 89 Reasons, and it didn't sell one copy. And if anybody who was alive, back in the 80s, in 1980, I don't know what, kind of like the late 80s, I was about, I wasn't even born. But there were these three movies called The Thief in the Night, A Distant Thunder. Can't remember the third one. Can you remember the third one? Image of the Beast. And they were shown in Ballysillan, and everybody thought this is the end times because you had the European Union being established and growing, and everything that was going on there. And certainly a lot of symbolism, it is part of end times, what's going on in Brussels and all of that there. But if you had said to anybody in the 1980s, mid-1980s, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, that we would be here in 2020, I don't think too many people would have believed you. It's 2021, isn't it? I left a year out. And so we've got to be so careful not to get caught up in dates and in trying to mark dates. What Jesus tells us, you don't know, just be ready. You don't know, just be ready. And we'll kind of finish with that there. Okay, so 3 questions were asked. The 3 questions are, when is this going to happen? The destruction of the temple. And in Luke 21, that is answered as Jesus says, watch for armies around Jerusalem. Then you know that the time is of the end is near. That's whenever the temple is going to be destroyed. But 2 other questions. What will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the sign of the end of the age? And Jesus gives us a number of different things there, and you'll have to take time yourself to read through Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13, and kind of pinpoint those things that Jesus has marked that will take place. They're the things that he's answering. And you can look them up, but there's a couple of things, because we could spend a long time just dissecting every little verse and unpacking it, but I don't really want to do that there. I just want to focus on a couple of things here. In verse 15 of Matthew 24, Jesus says this. He says, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So last week we shared how that a lot of people believed that Daniel, because Daniel was so specific and so accurate in his prophecies, the people actually didn't believe that the book of Daniel was written whenever it was written. The people actually said it was written, even just before the time of Jesus, that it was actually made up, because people were like, it can't be that accurate. It had to be written after the events took place that he prophesied would happen. But Jesus is referencing Daniel. And if Jesus is referencing Daniel, then therefore we can trust that what Daniel prophesied, he prophesied before the events, that everything that happens in the book of Daniel we can say is absolute truth. And so Daniel gives these prophecies. So if you look at Daniel chapter 8 and verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one who said, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. This is something that Daniel is prophesying about that is going to come later on. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, we read these words. 27, he will confirm a covenant for the many with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. You know what? We'll leave that there and we'll focus on this, because this is where I want to get to. So remember at the start how we talked about these 77s? 69 sevens have already happened. When it comes to end times is mainly about the return of Jesus Christ and the nation of Israel. It's also about the world, but it's mainly about Jesus Christ returning to this earth, and about how Jesus deals with the nation of Israel, and then how he deals with the rest of the world. But Israel is God's nation. We talked about this last week. How that God chose Abraham. And you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the 12 sons of Jacob who become the 12 kind of patriarchs of Judaism and of the nation of Israel. So God chose them. He chose the Jews to be his people and to be his nation. And throughout the Old Testament, it's about Israel. It's about the Jews. It's about how God deals with them. It's about how they live their lives and how they respond to to God and to God's laws, and to how God wants to operate with them. It's about their rebellion, about their sin. It's about all of that. But then there's something greater to come, because the law would not save them. It won't save us. It won't save anyone. And that's where Jesus steps into the scene of time. And he becomes a sacrifice for the sin of all mankind. But Jesus hasn't finished with Israel. In Acts chapter 2, at the day of Pentecost, you've got the birth of the early church. So something kind of shifts as Jesus ascends to heaven and the Holy Spirit descends. It's not that Jesus has now finished with Israel, but you've now got the beginning of what's known as the church age. This is the age we're living in right now. We are currently living in the church age. But what I believe will happen is the church will be raptured, will be lifted up, removed. And then you've got the last 7 years where God will finally deal with his nation, with the nation of Israel. We know that there to be the 7-year tribulation period. And this is what's being spoken of here. So in verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9, Daniel says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. So at the minute, we have this war going on between Israel and Gaza, or between Israel and the Palestinians, that has been going on for a very, very, very long time. And what Israel really, really seeks for, believe it or not, is peace. Regardless of what you may hear on the media and the twisted stories that we may hear coming through the media concerning Israel and the Palestinians, is that Israel really wants peace. Someone will enter the political arena, will enter this scene of time, will come in and will confirm a covenant of peace between Palestine and Israel. It will be a man who will appear on our TV screens. We'll be able to see him. He will rise up through the ranks, through the political ranks. He will have a place of prominence and a place of authority. And he will bring about a peace agreement between the Palestinians and between Israel. That man will be the Antichrist. And what Daniel is saying here is he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, so what Daniel is saying is there will be a temple where the Jews will be sacrificing their animals. Because what Daniel is saying is there's going to be an end to the sacrifices. So what has to happen is, in Jerusalem, there has to be a rebuilding of the temple, where the Jews are able to once again, bring their sacrifices to the temple, bring their animals to be sacrificed to atone for their sins. Because the Jewish people don't believe that Jesus was their Messiah. And they will want to go back to those animal sacrifices that we read about in the Old Testament. And so Daniel is warning us. He's saying there's going to be a guy who's going to come in. It's the Antichrist. He's going to bring about a peace treaty for 7 years between the Palestinians and the nation of Israel. And he's going to come across, and we're going to deal with him at some point in the next few weeks. I think next week we're going to look at the tribulation, and we will talk about the Antichrist. And before that, I want to talk about the spirit of Antichrist. And so he's going to bring about this peace agreement for 7 years. He is going to look like a man of peace. He's going to talk like a man of peace. You know the way politicians come on and they say one thing, but then they go away and they do something else? He's going to take it to a whole nother level. He is Satan personified, a man of evil. But he will look the part, he will dress the part, and he will speak the part. And everybody will look at him and go, isn't he amazing? Isn't he fantastic? We love him. Some people will even say, we worship him. This is what's going to happen. He's going to have such a high standing. He's going to come on the TV screens. And everyone, oh, isn't he? Listen to what he's saying. He's absolutely amazing. He's absolutely brilliant. He's going to bring about this peace agreement. And for the first 3.5 years, it's going to be peace. But after 3.5 years, he's going to reveal his true colors as to who he is. And at that point in time, he's going to end the sacrifices in the temple, as Daniel says here. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So he's going to end sacrifices, and he's going to set up an abomination that causes desolation. What is that abomination that causes desolation that we have heard Matthew talk about here? Very often, what I see in prophecy and what is to happen at the end of the age, or at some point, has in some way already happened before. And so there have been many antichrists. Hitler, for me, was an antichrist. He wanted to destroy the Jews. And this is what the antichrist, this is what his objective will be, to destroy God's people. As we looked at last week at Daniel's prophecies about the kingdoms, after the Roman Empire, after the Greeks, Alexander the Great dies at a young age, and then there's this squabble, and it's split kind of into four smaller kingdoms. And out of those four comes this one guy. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. You look up your history then. Antiochus, Antiochus Epiphanes. So what's happening, just to give you a bit of historical context, and we're going to be coming to a close, is that Daniel has prophesied. If you remember last year, Daniel has prophesied that God is going to punish Israel 7 times over for their sin. So they're going to in some way be in exile. They're not going to be a nation. And whenever you do the maths, it takes you from 567 BC until 1948. That's how long that period is going to be. And that's whenever Israel became a nation in 1948. They were a nation at the time of Jesus, but they weren't looking after their own affairs. They were under occupation from Rome. So they always had been, under the Greeks and then under the Romans and under others. But then what happens in Luke 21, Jesus prophesies about the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. That happened in AD 70, where Jerusalem is destroyed. If you ever go to Israel and you'll go to a place called Masada, and Masada is this huge, big, like tabletop mountain, and you can see there's kind of like ridge that has been built by the Romans just with soil as they built it up, because the Jews barricaded themselves into Masada, and the Romans attacked them, and the Jews actually all committed suicide as they were waiting because they had no escape. And so as part of that, Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70. What Jesus prophesied comes true. And there's no nation of Israel again until 1948. And in 167, so after the Greeks, you've got this guy Antiochus Epiphanes that rises to take control. And this is an evil man. He's a dictator. He's a bad ruler. A crazy, crazy man. And he takes over Jerusalem. They move in, they take over Jerusalem. And even though you've still got Jews that are living there, it's not necessarily, they're not looking after their own affairs. And so this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, he's kind of bombarding them. And Antiochus Epiphanes basically means the God who appears or reveals himself. So he set himself up as God. I am God. I'm revealing myself to you. That was how he viewed himself. And what he sought to do, he's kind of like, this is around about 160s BC. And what he seeks to do is to eradicate Judaism. For me, he's kind of like a Hitler. He's looking to destroy the Jews. He's looking to eradicate Judaism, the Jewish religion. And what he did was he said that all Jewish practices were forbidden, And if anybody did anything that was in any way Jewish related, then that meant death, which meant that the baby boys weren't allowed to be circumcised and you weren't allowed to follow your religious practices. And they would actually go through families and check, and if any baby boys had been circumcised, then that family would be put to death. He was doing this kind of like once a month. He would implement a search and go through things like that there. Anyone who created a copy of the Old Testament scriptures or who was reading them or had possession of a copy would be put to death. He erected, and this is the abomination that causes desolation, because you had a temple, the temple that was built back then, the second temple, the Temple of Solomon. And within the temple, within the Holy of Holies, remember, in the day of Moses, as Moses built the tabernacle, there were certain portions, certain sections of that tent that then was transferred over to the temple. So you had outside the tent or outside the temple, then you came in to the outer courts, you went into the holy place, and then you went into the Holy of Holies. That was where the very presence of God was, and that was where the priest, the high priest, would go in only once a year on the Day of Atonement. No one else could go in there. That's where the presence of God was. That was the most holy place. You didn't mess with the most holy place. And what Antiochus Epiphanes does is he erects an idol to Zeus in the Holy of Holies in the temple, and he's offering pigs as sacrifices in villages and to the idol Zeus. It was an abomination that caused desolation. It was an abomination to God. It was an abomination to the Jewish people. So Daniel is prophesying in Daniel chapter 9 about this abomination that causes desolation. And we can look forward to Antiochus Epiphanes. For me, he was like a little Antichrist. But this is what sparked what we know today to be the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. The Jews, coming up to Christmas time, will celebrate Hanukkah. We celebrate Christmas, they celebrate Hanukkah. They remember the revolt, the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus and against his armies and his people. And this sparked a revolt because of this abomination that causes desolation. So Jesus is picking up on what Daniel has said. Daniel has prophesied this, and it happened in the 160s BC under Antiochus Epiphanes. But Jesus is saying, see what Daniel said? It's going to happen again. At the end times, it's going to happen again. So what we've got to look out for is a rebuilding of the temple. Just by the way, on that there, the temple has actually been rebuilt. There are these institutions in Israel that they've got all the pieces of the temple built and stored away. And every so often, there are these vans and trucks and trailers that actually drive to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to set up and to start to rebuild the temple, and they're turned away. But they've got it all rebuilt. They've got all the artifacts. Everything is there. They're just waiting on the nod and the go-ahead to go to the Temple Mount and to begin to build. It's there. It just needs to be put in place. The problem, obviously, is that you've got this gold dome, the Dome of the Rock, which is where the trouble has been taking place over the last couple of weeks. Because there was this belief that the Dome of the Rock is built on where the temple was. But there's actually now these new beliefs that in excavations, that people are now saying, you know what? It's not here. It's actually down here. Because what is going to happen is whenever Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives, he's going to walk down the Mount of Olives, down the Kidron Valley, up into Jerusalem through the eastern gate. And the temple would normally line up with the eastern gate. And so there's some people that have an excavator to saying, you know what? It's not where the dome is. It's actually just to the left of the dome. It's actually here. So there's this belief that the temple and the dome will actually be side by side. And I can imagine as part of the Antichrist coming in and bringing about this peace agreement that they're allowed to have the temple and the dome side by side. So what Jesus is prophesying will happen has in some way already happened, but it's going to happen again, where the Antichrist will reveal his true colors after 3.5 years, and he will set up in the newly rebuilt temple after 3.5 years an idol, either to himself or to a god, Zeus, Apollo, whatever, I don't know. But that's what will happen. I'm almost done, and then we can have a couple of questions just relating to this. Jesus finishes, kind of goes on, and he says, as it was in the days of Noah, and you can read about that through Genesis chapter 6. And you know, this is what we've got to be aware of. And again, what Jesus talks about, he talks about the fig tree. and about the other trees. And he says, see, whenever it's growing leaves, then you know that summer's near. And so it doesn't take a genius to know that we're kind of coming into summer. You're sitting out in the back garden today, and the sun's splitting the trees, and there's leaves coming onto the trees that were at one time over the last number of months were barren, and you now see leaves growing, and summer's coming. And we may not know the specific day or hour, but Jesus says we can know the times and the seasons. And I believe that the season that we're living in is a season very much in which Jesus Christ could return. And he talks about as it was in the days of Noah, where people were eating and drinking, being merry. No one had a thought for God. No one cared about God. No one wanted to hear about God. Noah spending years building this ark that was going to be their redemption, that was going to be their safety, that was going to be their freedom, that was going to be their protection from the wrath to come. It's a picture of Jesus. He is our protection. He is our deliverer. He is the one that will take us out of the wrath to come. And what Jesus tells us, what he tells the disciples, your job is to watch and be ready. Let me finish with this very, very quickly. In John chapter 14, Jesus speaking to his disciples, just the disciples gathered in the upper room, intimate time with his disciples. And he says to his disciples, I must go and prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms. I must go and prepare a place for you. If it were not so, then I wouldn't tell you. He says, if I go and prepare a place for you, then I will come back and take you to be where I am. What Jesus is doing is it's kind of like what would happen within a marriage in a Jewish context. The groom would go to his bride. And it's kind of like a marriage proposal sort of a thing, as part of the whole marriage celebration thing. Long before the marriage, he would go to his bride and he would say to his bride, I'm going to go to my Father's house and I'm going to prepare a place for us. And then when it's done, I'm going to come back and take you to be with me. And what he would do is he would go to his father's community, to his father's home. He would either build an extension or a house very, very close by, because they live in very close community. And the bride, after the marriage, would go and would live with the groom in the father's house, in the father's community, in the father's place. And this is what Jesus is saying to his disciples. So the groom would go off and would prepare a place for us. With Jesus, he's preparing, we believe, heaven for us. The bride's only objective, her only concern, was to be ready, was to be prepared. She would not know when the groom would come. The groom wouldn't even know when he was to come, because the groom has to wait on the father. Because the father would say to the groom, okay, son, everything's ready, go get your bride. And then he would show up, usually at midnight, with his entourage, with the best men, with the groomsmen, with his friends. All the boys would show up, and it would be a party. The bride's only objective was to be ready. And what she had to do is every night she would have to light a lamp at her window, because whenever the groom comes, then he's looking for the window with the light on it. That's my bride. She just had to be ready. The church, us, we're the bride of Christ. Jesus is telling us, be you ready. You don't know when I'm coming back. Your job is just to be ready. In Matthew 24, as we read through that there, Jesus is telling us, be ready. And then he goes on in Matthew 25. Let me see if I can get it here. So Matthew 24, he's telling us we don't know when. You've just got to be ready. And then in Matthew 25, he tells this parable of 10 virgins, brides. 5 of them have oil for their lamps, 5 don't. 5 are ready for the groom to come, 5 aren't. It's kind of following on from Jesus telling us to be ready. And so the bride, every night she would light her lamp, and she's wondering, is this going to be the night that he's going to come and get me? Because she doesn't know. And maybe night after night she would be in some way disappointed. And what we're told is that there are 5 that get so disappointed that they run out of oil for their lamps. They begin to go to the other 5 that have the oil and say, give us some oil. And they're like, no. We need to keep our lamps lit. We need to be ready for the return of the groom. And so what Jesus is saying is, you don't know when, but you've just got to be ready. And that's our job as the church of Jesus Christ, as his bride. Our job is to be ready for his return.